The morning of June 9th, 721, arrived over southern Gaul the way death arrives, quietly, without announcement, carried on a wind that smelled of smoke and scorched earth, and something older, something that had been burning since the edges of the world first caught fire. The sun had not yet cleared the ridgeline east of Toulouse when the birds fell silent. Not the gradual quiet of early morning, when darkness still clings to the riverbank, and the night creatures have not yet given way to the day ones. This was a different silence, the kind that fills a room after someone says something that cannot be unsaid, the kind that settles over a battlefield after the last screams have faded and only the carrion birds remain. Stand on the banks of the Garonne River in the year of our Lord 721, and look at what surrounds the city of Toulouse. It is a sight that should not exist, a sight that the men and women huddled behind those thick Roman walls have been staring at for 3 months, watching it grow larger every week, watching it pulse with life and firelight and the absolute certainty of conquest. The Umayyad siege camp stretches as far as the eye can carry, a city unto itself, born of iron discipline and imperial ambition, bristling with catapults and battering rams and the banners of a caliphate that has never, not once, been turned back on European soil. The camp breathes like a living thing. Fires burn in 100 places. The smell of lamb roasting, of leather and oil, of horse sweat and sharpened iron drifts toward the walls on the morning breeze like a taunt from God himself. Inside Toulouse, the flour is nearly gone. The wells are still clean, but the faces of the defenders are not. 3 months of siege will carve a man down to something angular and hollow-eyed, something that flinches at sounds it once ignored. The garrison that started this ordeal with straight backs and firm grips now leans on spears more for support than threat. Children have stopped crying, because children who cry long enough eventually stop. Old men mutter prayers they have not said since childhood. The walls are holding. But the walls are made of stone, and stone does not feel hunger. Beyond those walls, on the far side of the Umayyad camp, in the dark tree line, where no Arab scout has bothered to look, something is moving. Duke Odo the Great, last independent ruler of Aquitaine, has come home. He brought no army of legend, no gleaming knights in gilded armour, no thundering cavalry 10,000 strong. He brought what he could gather in 3 desperate months of riding through a land that the Umayyad tide had already begun to swallow. Gascon warriors who fight with the ferocity of men defending their children's bedrooms. Frankish soldiers from the southern territories who owe no man in this war their death, but chose to come anyway. And Aquitanian fighters who have been staring at the back of their duke's horse since the day he rode away, and have been waiting, with a patience that borders on religious, for the moment he would turn it around and come back. He came back on the eve of their surrender. He came back when hope had shrunk to the size of a prayer, whispered through cracked lips. And what happened next, on this one morning in June, on this unremarkable plain beside a river, in a land the Romans once called the Jewel of Gaul, would be remembered in the Muslim world for 4.5 centuries as the greatest disaster of their European campaign. The Umayyad Caliphate, which had not suffered a single meaningful defeat in 10 years of conquest across 2 continents, would learn on this day what defeat tastes like. The lesson would be taught by a man history has largely forgotten. Not Charles Martel, not Charlemagne. A man named Odo. A man who refused to die on a schedule that suited his enemies. This battle did not just save a city, it saved the continent's future, and the man who saved it was erased from the story before the ink was dry. To understand what happened at Toulouse in the summer of 721, you must first understand what kind of force was encamped outside its walls. You must understand not just the numbers, though the numbers are staggering, but the momentum. Because what the Umayyad Caliphate represented in the year 721 was not merely a large army. It was a historical force, with a decade of perfect victories behind it, and the absolute conviction that God had appointed it to remake the world. 10 years before the siege of Toulouse, the Iberian Peninsula had been a Christian kingdom. The Visigoths had ruled Hispania for 3 centuries, building cathedrals and minting coins, and fighting one another over succession rights, the way Germanic kingdoms always did, noisily and without resolution. They were not a decadent people. They were not a weak people. They were simply a people who had never faced anything quite like what came across the Strait of Gibraltar in the spring of 711. Tariq ibn Ziyad crossed from North Africa with roughly 1,700 men. That number is not a typo. 1,700 soldiers, the size of a modest garrison, the strength of a minor lord's retinue, stepped ashore on European soil and began an act of conquest that would swallow a kingdom whole. King Roderick of the Visigoths came south with his full army to crush this incursion, the way a man steps on a spider he finds crossing his floor. The armies met near the Barbate River in July of 711. Roderick did not survive the afternoon. What followed was a cascade, the way an avalanche begins with a single stone. Tariq's force was reinforced by his superior, Musa ibn Nasser, who arrived with thousands more Arab soldiers the following year. Together, they swept north and west and east across the Iberian Peninsula with a speed that left the surviving Visigothic nobility gasping. City after city fell, not all by force, some by negotiation, by the pragmatic calculation of local rulers who saw which way the wind was blowing and chose survival over martyrdom. Córdoba, Mérida, Toledo, Saragossa, each name a stone in a wall that was no longer standing. By 715, the Umayyad governor Abd al-Aziz ibn Musa ruled Al-Andalus from Seville. Most of the Iberian Peninsula was under caliphate administration. The exceptions were the remote mountain kingdoms in the far northwest, Asturias, the Basque Highlands, places too poor and too steep to be worth the effort of conquest, places where the defeated and the determined had retreated to nurse their grievances and plan, in the way that defeated people always plan, an eventual return. But the caliphate was not interested in those mountain kingdoms. The caliphate was looking north. In 717, Umayyad forces crossed the Pyrenees for the first time. It was reconnaissance initially, probing the terrain, testing the resistance, seeing what lay on the other side of those immense stone walls that nature had built between Hispania and Gaul. What they found was Septimania, a region of ancient Roman cities, rich agricultural land, and a crumbling Visigothic rump government that barely controlled its own shadow. Al-Sam ibn Malik al-Khawlani received his appointment as Governor-General of Al-Andalus from Caliph Umar II, and from the moment he settled into the governor's palace in Córdoba, he demonstrated that he was not a man who thought in terms of raids. Al-Sam thought in terms of permanence. He minted the first purely Arab coins in Al-Andalus, a statement of administrative intent, a declaration that this was not occupation, but governance. He reorganized the province's finances, established reliable supply chains across the Strait of Gibraltar, and then turned his attention to the map on his wall and began to trace the lines of what came next. What came next was Narbonne. In 719, some sources say 720, and the discrepancy matters less than the outcome. Al-Sam led his army north through the Pyrenean passes and descended on Septimania like a stone dropped from a great height. The Chronicle of Marsac, written by Christian monks who had no reason to flatter their conquerors, records that the inhabitants of Narbonne were slaughtered. The city fell. With Narbonne in Umayyad hands, the Caliphate had a Mediterranean port, a logistical base, and a staging ground for everything that came after. Everything that came after was methodical and merciless. Béziers, Agde, Lodève, Maguelone, the city that would become Montpellier, Nîmes. Each Visigothic city in Septimania fell before Al-Sam's advance, their walls too old, or their garrisons too thin, or their will to resist too thoroughly broken by the decade-long demonstration that the Umayyad Caliphate could not be stopped. Al-Sam established garrisons in each conquered city, not raiding parties, but permanent military presences, the administrative skeleton of a new province. And then Al-Sam did something that reveals more about his ambition than any chronicle can directly state. He went back. He crossed back over the Pyrenees into Al-Andalus, gathered more troops, more siege equipment, more of the logistical apparatus that a serious campaign of conquest requires, and returned north with a larger force than the one he had brought before. His target was Toulouse. The historian Ian Meadows has argued, with considerable persuasion, that Al-Sam's strategic vision was nothing less than the Garonne River Valley, the great corridor of fertile lowland that stretches from the Pyrenees to the Atlantic, a territory that, once controlled, would link Umayyad holdings in a vast arc from the Mediterranean coast of Africa through Iberia, across the Pyrenees, and all the way to the shores of the Western Ocean. Toulouse was not merely the capital of Aquitaine, it was the keystone of that arc. Take Toulouse, and the Atlantic was 3 weeks' march away. Take Toulouse, and the territory between the Pyrenees and the Loire had no natural defensive feature capable of stopping a determined advance. Al-Sam understood this. He came to Toulouse not to raid, not to extract tribute, not to demonstrate power and withdraw. He came to stay. Against this machinery of conquest stood one man. Odo the Great had been Duke of Aquitaine since around the year 700, and the years between then and 721 had taught him exactly two things: that the world was trying to kill him, and that dying was not acceptable. His territory was the great southwestern duchy of Gaul, stretching from the Loire River in the north to the Pyrenees in the south, from the Atlantic coast in the west to the edge of Provence in the east. On paper, it was an impressive domain. In practice, it was a land caught between hammer and anvil. To the south, the Umayyad Caliphate, which had just swallowed his Visigothic neighbours and was now looking at his own borders with the calm, appraising eye of a man who has decided what he wants and is simply waiting for the right moment to take it. To the north, Charles Martel, the iron-willed mayor of the palace, who controlled the Frankish military machine and who regarded Odo's independent duchy with the proprietary interest of a man eyeing a piece of land that he intends to own eventually, regardless of what the current occupant thinks about it. Odo had fought both of them at various points, had allied with Martel's enemies when it suited him, had accepted temporary submission when it did not. He was not a man of simple loyalties. He was a man of survival, And survival in the year 721 required a flexibility of principle that a more idealistic person might find uncomfortable. Odo was not uncomfortable. Odo had long since made his peace with the world as it actually was. When Al-Sam's army materialized outside the walls of Toulouse in the early spring of 721, Odo was not inside the city. The reasons for this are not entirely clear from the surviving sources, whether he was caught outside when the siege began, or whether he deliberately chose not to be trapped inside, calculating that his value was higher as a free commander than as a besieged one. What the sources agree on is what he did next. He rode north to find Charles Martel and ask for help. Martel refused. The Austrasians were fighting the Saxons in the north. That was the official reason. The real reason was that Charles Martel was not in the habit of rescuing men he expected to absorb eventually. And a Toulouse under Umayyad siege was, from a cold political calculation, not necessarily worse for Martel than a Toulouse defended successfully by an independent Odo. Let the Umayyads and the Aquitanians grind each other down. The Franks would be ready when the grinding was done. Odo received this answer and rode south without wasting time on anger. Anger was a luxury he could not afford. He had a city to save, an army to find, and 3 months to do it. Because 3 months was roughly how long he estimated Toulouse could hold before its garrison starved. He was almost too late. The city of Toulouse in the year 721 was old in the way that only Roman cities are old. Old in its bones, old in the geometry of its streets, old in the thickness of its walls, which had been built for exactly the kind of situation they were now enduring. The Romans had understood siege warfare the way they understood everything, systematically, without sentiment, with the cold engineering logic of men who intended to build things that lasted. The walls were thick, they were high, they were reinforced at intervals with towers that allowed defenders to lay flanking fire on any attackers who approached the base. The city sat on the west bank of the Garonne River, which provided one natural barrier that no siege equipment could overcome. From the east, from the north, from the south, the walls presented an obstacle that Al-Sam's engineers had been studying for 3 months without finding a clean solution. But walls do not eat. Walls do not grow weak from hunger or crack under the weight of despair. Walls are patient, in the way that stone is patient, absolutely and without limit. The people inside the walls were not stone. Al-Sam's army had cut the roads leading into Toulouse in the first weeks of the siege. The grain stores that the city had accumulated before the investment, carefully because Odo's administrators had understood what was coming even if they could not stop it, were running out. The military rations had been cut twice already. The civilian population was on half portions. The horses, which represented both mobility and a last reserve of protein, were beginning to look less like strategic assets and more like future meals. Al-Sam's siege camp had grown into something that dwarfed the city it surrounded. The Umayyad governor-general had brought everything a sustained siege required. Catapults of varying sizes, from the small bolt-throwing engines that could pick off defenders on the walls to the massive stone-throwing devices that could pound a section of masonry into rubble given enough time. He had battering rams, shielded by wooden galleries that would protect their crews from the archers above. He had ladders and grappling hooks and all the 1,000 pieces of equipment that the Caliphate's military engineers had refined over a century of warfare from the deserts of Arabia to the plains of Iberia. He had Arab cavalry, fast, mobile, skilled in the kind of open field engagement that could intercept a relief force before it reached the city walls. He had Berber fighters from North Africa, who had been the cutting edge of every major Umayyad military operation for decades. Warriors who had absorbed the shock of rapid conversion to Islam and turned it into a ferocity that professional soldiers acknowledged with the grudging respect that only men who have faced something dangerous can offer. He had mercenaries, specialists, Basque slingers who could put a stone through a visor slot at 200 paces. Various auxiliary units that had been gathered from the length and breadth of the Caliphate's European holdings. This army had never lost. Not in Europe, not once. And that, in the summer of 721, was precisely the problem. There is a particular danger that attaches to an army that has never lost. It is not weakness. It is a specific kind of blindness that grows from an unbroken record of success. A gradual, organic, almost invisible decay in the habits of caution. Al-Sam's army had been outside Toulouse for 3 months. 3 months of watching the city grow weaker, of receiving intelligence that the garrison was cutting rations and the grain stores were depleting, of knowing, with the certainty of mathematics, that the city would fall. The only question was when. When the outcome of a contest is certain, the attention begins to drift toward what comes after. Al-Sam's officers were already having conversations about the administration of the conquered province, the distribution of plunder, the logistics of the next campaign. The soldiers in the trenches and the camp were doing what soldiers always do when a siege enters its final weeks. They relaxed. Not completely, not stupidly. They maintained their positions, kept their weapons at hand, sent their regular patrols. But the outer perimeter of the camp, the side that faced away from Toulouse, away from the enemy, the side from which no threat had ever come in 3 months, received less attention. The scouts sent in that direction returned with nothing. Eventually, the scouts were sent less frequently. This is not negligence. This is human nature. The threat was in front of them. The threat had always been in front of them. Meanwhile, in the dark of the forest north and west of Toulouse, Odo the Great was assembling the instrument of their destruction. He had spent 3 months riding the roads of Aquitaine and the territories beyond, collecting promises and converting them into soldiers. He had gone to the Gascon lords in the foothills of the Pyrenees, proud, fierce men who spoke their own language and followed their own law, but who understood perfectly well that an Umayyad army sitting in Toulouse would eventually come for their valleys next. He had reached into the Frankish territories along the lower Rhône, finding men whose families had settled there generations ago, and who regarded this land as theirs, with the passionate attachment of people who have no other. He had called in debts and favours and obligations accumulated over 2 decades of ruling. What gathered in the forest outside Toulouse was not an army in the imperial Roman sense, not a unified professional force with standardized equipment and synchronized drill. It was something rawer and, in its own way, more dangerous. It was a collection of men who had specific personal reasons to want the army on the other side of those trees to die. The Gascons brought their slings and their short swords and their absolute knowledge of the terrain. Every creek bed, every stand of timber, every dip in the ground that could conceal a line of men until the last possible moment. The Frankish soldiers from the south brought heavier equipment, more formal military discipline, the experience of men who had fought in the kind of set-piece battles that the Carolingian wars of the north had turned into an art form. The Aquitanians, who formed the core of the force, brought something harder to quantify but impossible to miss: rage. 3 months of watching their capital city die from the inside had done things to these men that no training could replicate. The night of June 8th, 721, found this force concealed in the tree line, roughly 2 miles from the western edge of the Umayyad siege camp. No fires, no cooking, no noise beyond the sounds that men make when they breathe and shift their weight and try not to think too hard about what the next several hours will bring. The night was warm, as June nights in southern Gaul tend to be, the kind of warmth that makes sleep attractive and vigilance expensive, that softens the edge of alertness just enough to matter. In the city behind the Umayyad camp, the surviving defenders were doing the mathematics of starvation. The garrison commander, unnamed in most of the surviving sources, a ghost of history performing heroic work without credit, had been rationing what remained with the precision of a man who knows that every day he holds costs exactly this many lives and that the account will eventually come due in full. The civilians in the city had been told what they needed to know and not what would destroy them. The walls were holding. Hold a little longer. Hold one more day. The soldiers on Toulouse's walls, who were still strong enough to stand watch that night, watched the Umayyad campfires burn in the darkness below them, and tried not to calculate how many more sunrises remained before the mathematics ran out. Among Odo's assembled force that night, the most significant object was not a weapon. It was bread. 3 loaves, or in some translations 3 sponges, sent by Pope Gregory II to Odo in the year 720 with the blessing of the Church and the explicit understanding that they were to be kept until the moment of maximum need. Odo had carried them for a year. Now, the night before the battle, he broke them apart with his own hands and distributed the fragments to his officers, who distributed them further. By the time the bread was gone, every man in the force had received a portion no larger than a thumbnail. No one who ate that bread would be killed in the battle to come. That is what the sources say. That is what people believed for centuries about what happened at Toulouse. Whether you believe it now is between you and the kind of God you worship. What is not a matter of faith is what Odo told his commanders when the bread was distributed. The plan was not complicated. The best plans rarely are. The force would move in pre-dawn darkness, using the tree line for cover as long as possible, then crossing the open ground between the forest and the camp's western edge at a run. Silence until contact. Then noise, everything they had. Drive into the camp, scatter the unprepared, create chaos, and do it fast enough that the garrison inside Toulouse would hear the battle and understand what it meant. The garrison would have to do the rest. They would have to open the gates. They would have to pour out of the city that had been their prison for 3 months and fight, starving, weakened, half dead, into the suddenly vulnerable rear of an army that was already reeling. It was the kind of plan that only works once. It was the kind of plan that works perfectly or fails catastrophically, and nothing in between. It required the garrison to have enough left in them to fight when the moment came. It required the Umayyad camp to be exactly as unprepared as Odo's intelligence suggested. It required everything to go right at the same time. Odo gave the order to move when the darkness was at its thickest, in the hour before false dawn, when the human body is at its lowest ebb, and the sentries on the night watch are fighting sleep with the desperate determination of men who know that falling asleep at their post is a death sentence, but cannot entirely convince their bodies of this. The horses' hooves were wrapped in cloth. The metal fittings of the armour had been bound with leather to prevent the betraying sound of steel on steel. The men moved through the darkness in long files, staying low, staying quiet. covering the ground between the tree line and the camp with the careful patience of men who understood that the element of surprise was the only advantage they had, and losing it before contact would transform their attack into a slaughter. Their slaughter. The first light of June 9th was still a promise rather than a fact when the silence broke. It broke from the west. One moment the pre-dawn air held nothing but the creak of cooling timber in the siege engines, the distant cough of a sentry, the low murmur of a camp in its deepest sleep. Then, a sound that the human brain processes before the conscious mind catches up to it. The sound of many feet moving fast over open ground. And then voices, the raw, uncontrolled voices of men who have been running in silence and have finally reached the point where silence no longer serves them. And then the first screams, sharp and specific, and immediately answered by more voices, more feet, more of everything that silence had been holding back. The Umayyad camp's western perimeter dissolved like salt in water. The sentries there, and there were sentries, it would be wrong to suggest the camp was unguarded, because Al-Sam was too experienced a commander for that, simply had no time. Between the first sound of the approaching force and its arrival at the tent lines, there were perhaps 30 seconds. Not enough time to raise a meaningful alarm. Not enough time to wake sleeping men and get weapons into hands that were still clumsy with sleep. Not enough time to do anything but be in the way of what was coming. Odo's Gascon warriors hit the western edge of the camp like a wave hitting a sandbar. Fast, low, and with a focused ferocity that the Umayyad soldiers sleeping in those tent lines had never experienced from that direction. The Gascons knew exactly what they were doing. They had been told not to stop for anything, not to loot, not to chase individual men into the dark, not to stop and fight a contained engagement with anyone who looked like they had organized resistance forming around them. Move. Keep moving. Drive east. Push the chaos forward. Behind the Gascons came the Frankish soldiers, heavier and slower, but hitting harder, driving into the spaces the Gascon advance had opened, engaging the knots of Umayyad fighters who had found their weapons and were trying to form the kind of defensive position that professional soldiers default to when everything around them is going wrong. The Franks were good at this kind of thing, the grinding, close-quarters work of clearing a camp that had been turned inside out by surprise. But what the Gascons had started, and the Franks were continuing, was not yet decisive. The Umayyad camp was immense. Even a surprise attack on the western perimeter was, in the immediate moments after contact, affecting only a fraction of the total force. In the eastern sections of the camp, the sections closest to the walls of Toulouse, where the siege operations had been conducted, men were waking up to the sound of fighting, reaching for their weapons, trying to understand what was happening and from which direction the threat was coming. This is the moment where the mathematics of the battle hung in absolute balance, and the outcome of that balance was determined not by anything Odo did, but by something that happened inside the city of Toulouse. Inside the walls, the garrison commander heard the sound of battle erupting behind the Umayyad lines. For one long moment, a moment that probably lasted less than 10 seconds, but felt to the men standing on that wall like a full minute of suspended reality, no one moved. The sound could mean anything. It could be a mutiny in the Umayyad camp. It could be a supply dispute turned violent. It could be something unrelated to the city entirely. The garrison had been telling itself stories of rescue for 3 months, and 3 months of disappointed hope teaches a man to mistrust his own desires. But the sound grew, and it came from the west, from outside the siege lines entirely. Someone on that wall made the decision. The names of individual soldiers do not survive in the histories of Toulouse 721. They have been swallowed by time and the indifference of chroniclers who were more interested in dukes and governors than in the garrison sergeants who opened city gates. But someone, at some point in those early morning minutes, gave the order to open the gates and go. The garrison of Toulouse had been starving for 3 months. They were weak. Many of them were sick. Their equipment was in various states of disrepair because 3 months of siege conditions does unkind things to iron and leather and the sinews of men who have not been eating enough. They should not, by any rational military assessment, have been capable of an effective offensive sortie from their walls. They poured out of those gates like a river that has been dammed for 3 months, finally finding a break in the dam. Everything they had felt for 3 months, the hunger, the fear, the helpless fury of watching your city die around you, while an enemy army sat outside your walls and waited with patient contempt, came out of those gates with them. They hit the Umayyad forces on the eastern side of the camp with the terrifying energy of men who have nothing left to lose and everything to gain. And the Umayyad soldiers on that side of the camp, who had just oriented themselves toward the threat from the west and were beginning to organize a response, suddenly discovered that they had a second problem coming from exactly the opposite direction. The trap had closed. Al-Sam ibn Malik al-Khawlani understood what was happening within minutes of the first contact. He was an experienced commander, and he was not stupid. And experienced commanders who are not stupid recognize a double envelopment when it manifests around them, regardless of how unwilling they are to believe it could happen. He began immediately doing what generals do when a battle begins to go wrong. He tried to stabilize the situation, restore some kind of order, find the tactical ground from which a recovery might be possible. But the camp was already fracturing. The problem with being surprised in your sleep in an encampment that you have built for offensive operations rather than defensive ones is that everything is wrong. The tent lines that had been arranged for the convenience of the besieging army were now a maze that channeled fleeing soldiers into dead ends and funneled them toward the attackers rather than away. The siege equipment, the catapults, the battering rams, the wooden galleries that had been positioned to face the walls of Toulouse, could not be turned around quickly enough to be useful. Heavy equipment that takes days to position cannot be repositioned in the middle of a panicked fight. The horses, which represented the Umayyad cavalry's greatest asset, were in the horse lines on the eastern side of the camp, and reaching them required crossing through the chaos that the garrison sortie had created. Some of the cavalry managed it, individual soldiers or small groups reaching their horses and mounting up, trying to use the one advantage they had. But cavalry is most dangerous when it operates in organized units under coordinated command. And organized units under coordinated command require time and space, and a chain of command that was operating normally. And none of those things existed on the morning of June 9th. By the time the sun had fully cleared the eastern ridge, and actual daylight was falling on the scene below it, the battle had sorted itself into something that was no longer really a battle in the conventional sense. It was a rout in formation, a collapse that was still fighting but had lost the coherence that fighting requires to be effective. Odo drove his main force through the center of the camp from the west, splitting the Umayyad formation in two. The garrison force from Toulouse was pushing in from the east. Between these two converging pressures, the middle section of the Umayyad camp, where most of the soldiers, the equipment, the supplies, and the command structure were concentrated, was being compressed into a shrinking space. Al-Sam tried to break out to the north, where the siege lines were thinner and the ground was more open. He gathered around him whatever organized units remained. The soldiers who had managed to equip themselves, the officers who had not yet broken, the men whose training and discipline held even when the situation was dissolving, and drove north with the specific, focused energy of a man who knows that what he is doing is the last viable option, and is therefore committing to it absolutely. He did not break through. The Gascon units on Odo's northern flank had anticipated exactly this. They had swung around during the initial attack, using the speed and terrain knowledge that made them what they were, and had positioned themselves precisely to intercept a breakout attempt from the north. When Al-Sam's organised remnant hit the northern line, it hit men who were ready for them and who were fighting on ground they knew. What happened next, in the place that Arabic chronicles would call Balat al-Shuhada, the path of the martyrs, was not a battle. It was a finality. Al-Sam ibn Malik al-Khawlani made his last stand in a field north of the main camp. Around him were the soldiers who had stayed, the ones who had not fled, not broken, not dissolved into the general chaos of the rout. They fought. The sources are clear on this. They fought with the kind of concentrated, professional ferocity that men who have accepted that they are probably going to die can sometimes access. A level of violence that is freed from the calculations of survival, and therefore operates by different rules. It was not enough. Odo's forces converged on the remaining pocket from 3 sides simultaneously. The soldiers around Al-Sam were cut down one by one. Al-Sam himself was hit, a wound serious enough to remove him from the fighting, but not immediately fatal, which meant that he would die later, carrying the knowledge of what had happened here, in this field, on this morning, when everything he had built and planned and executed with such systematic precision came apart in the space of a few hours. He managed to get away. Some of his soldiers managed to get away. The routes east toward Narbonne were not completely sealed, and men who are sufficiently desperate can find paths that an organized pursuit cannot always follow. Among the men who escaped was a Umayyad officer named Abd al-Rahman al-Ghafiqi. He retreated south with whatever he could save. He would be back, 11 years later, with a larger army on a different field. But that is a different story. The pursuit lasted through the morning and into the afternoon. Odo's cavalry, what cavalry he had, ranged through the countryside, running down fleeing soldiers, taking prisoners, cutting off organised groups before they could reconsolidate. The Gascon light fighters ranged wide, familiar with every path and hollow in the terrain, making the retreat from Toulouse a series of ugly, contained engagements in which the disparity in numbers that had dominated the initial situation no longer applied. Because disparity in numbers matters most when the larger force can concentrate, and the Umayyad force was not concentrating. It was dissolving. By mid-morning, the siege camp itself was in Odo's hands. The massive catapults stood silent and useless, pointed at walls they would never now break. The supply stores, grain, oil, preserved meat, the logistical foundation of months of campaigning, were there to be taken or destroyed. The equipment that had been positioned for a siege of Toulouse was now the property of the man who had just saved it. Odo walked through the captured camp with the careful attention of a commander assessing what he had taken and what it meant. And what it meant was this. The Umayyad Caliphate's instrument for the conquest of Western Gaul was gone. Not damaged, not repulsed, gone. But there was still the East to think about, and still soldiers to account for, and still the question of Al-Sam, who was wounded and retreating toward Narbonne, with whatever fraction of his army had managed to stay coherent through the collapse. The sun reached its zenith over a battlefield that had, 6 hours earlier, been the most powerful military position in Western Gaul, and was now a graveyard of ambition. Inside Toulouse, the gates were open. The people who had been surviving behind those walls came out into the daylight of a different world than the one that had existed when the sun rose. They moved through the abandoned eastern sections of the siege camp, past the dead, past the discarded weapons and torn tents, and the 1,000 pieces of equipment that an army leaves behind when it runs. Children who had grown up in the confined, frightened space of a besieged city walked for the first time in 3 months through open ground without walls on all sides. Some of them did not know what to do with the space. Some of them simply sat down in the sunlight and looked at the sky. The city had been saved, but the day was not yet over. Odo organized the pursuit with the systematic thoroughness of a man who knew that a defeated enemy who is allowed to reconstitute is not a defeated enemy, but a delayed problem. He sent his mobile forces east and north, maintaining pressure on the retreating Umayyad columns, denying them the time and space they needed to stop and reform. The goal was not just victory, but annihilation. Not of men, necessarily, but of capability. Break the siege equipment, destroy the supply chains, make the cost of coming back so high that the calculus of empire pointed elsewhere. The Battle of Toulouse was over by afternoon. What remained was the count of the living, of the dead, and of what it all meant. The dead were beyond counting, and so the chroniclers counted them anyway, with the magnificent indifference to arithmetic that medieval historians reserved for battles they wished to commemorate. In a letter to Pope Gregory II, written in the days after the battle, while the pyres were still burning and the prisoners were still being catalogued, Odo the Great claimed to have killed 375,000 Saracens in a single day, and to have lost 1,500 of his own men. The Pope, who had sent the Blessed Bread and who had considerable political reasons to celebrate Christian military victories, appears to have accepted this figure without undue scepticism. It was recorded, it was repeated. The number 375,000 appears again in the sources for the Battle of Tours 11 years later. The same figure, the same impossible arithmetic, suggesting that either one of the most famous battles in European history was being inflated to match the other, or that both figures came from the same tradition of commemorative exaggeration that does not concern itself with plausibility. Modern historians, who do concern themselves with plausibility, note that the Umayyad military operation in all of Gaul could not have supported a force anywhere near that size, given the logistical constraints of the period. What the Arab historians said was simpler and, in its own way, more telling. They agreed without exception that the Battle of Toulouse was a total disaster. Not a setback, not a defeat to be analysed and compensated for. A disaster. The kind of outcome that gets written into the institutional memory of a military culture because it represents something fundamental going wrong. The Mozarabic Chronicle of 754, written by a Christian author living under Umayyad rule in Al-Andalus, and therefore a source with no interest in flattering the Christian side, records the scale of losses at Toulouse in terms that make clear that what happened was not an ordinary battlefield reverse. Many thousands slain, the chronicle says. The force that Al-Sam had assembled, Arabs, Berbers, mercenaries, the military complex of a caliphate at the height of its power, had been crushed. Al-Sam himself reached Narbonne alive. He was critically wounded, and the wounds did not heal. He died in Narbonne in the weeks following the battle, having lived long enough to know that he would not be given the opportunity to understand what went wrong, to rebuild what had been broken, to return with the kind of force that could take seriously the lesson Toulouse had taught. The governorship of Al-Andalus passed to Anbasa ibn Suhaym al-Kalbi, who spent his 4 years in office consolidating the caliphate's position in Septimania, rather than reaching for the more ambitious prizes al-Sam had sought. The battlefield north and west of Toulouse was silent by evening. Those who walked through it in the days after described something that had the quality of nightmare transformed into geography. The physical remains of a vast military enterprise that had ceased to exist in the span of a single morning. The catapults stood where they had been built, massive and useless, already being evaluated by Odo's engineers for what could be salvaged and what should simply be burned. The tent lines were collapsed in some places, still standing in others, surrounded by the accumulated debris of a months-long encampment. Cooking equipment, personal effects, weapons too damaged to be worth collecting. The 1,000 small objects that constitute a soldier's life, and that become simply refuse when that soldier is no longer alive to claim them. The horses were still there, many of them. The cavalry horses of the Umayyad force, valuable enough in their own right to be significant prizes, trained for warfare in a way that ordinary work animals are not, had not all been taken in the flight. Odo's men collected them carefully, understanding that horses represented both immediate military value and the kind of long-term strategic asset that a Duke of Aquitaine, who could never be entirely certain when the next crisis would arrive, could not afford to waste. The civilians of Toulouse moved through this landscape with the careful attention of people learning to believe that something is real. 3 months of siege had changed the way they moved, the way they looked at open space, the way they responded to sounds that were not the sounds of the city under threat. The garrison soldiers, who had poured from the gates in the final moments of the battle, were already tending to their wounded, counting their dead, trying to locate friends and unit mates in the confusion of the aftermath. Some of them had not eaten a real meal in weeks. The Umayyad camp's food stores, now in Aquitanian hands, were being distributed to the people of the city with the methodical urgency of men who understood that starvation does not stop the moment the siege does. Odo received word of al-Sam's escape and ordered the pursuit to continue toward Narbonne, but not to overextend. A commander who understood that a victorious army that chases too far becomes vulnerable in exactly the way that al-Sam's army had been vulnerable that morning. The Umayyad garrisons in Septimania, in Narbonne, in the other cities al-Sam had taken, were still in place, still armed, still behind their own walls. The Battle of Toulouse had been won. The campaign for Gaul was not over. What was over, permanently, was the Umayyad Caliphate's first attempt to make Gaul its own. Pope Gregory II received Odo's letter and replied with gifts, material expressions of the Church's gratitude to the man it had declared a champion of Roman Christianity. The Pope understood, even if later history did not adequately remember, what had been at stake outside the walls of Toulouse. The Christian West had been holding its breath since 711. The battle outside one city in southern Gaul had not resolved the threat, not permanently, not finally. But it had demonstrated something that the 10-year string of Umayyad victories had made it easy to forget, that the caliphate could bleed. Charles Martel, in his territories to the north, received the news and said nothing that the sources have preserved. He was busy with his Saxons. He was building his army. He was, as Edward Gibbon would argue 12 centuries later, spending the decade between Toulouse and Tours, doing exactly what a man does when he has received adequate warning that a very large problem is coming his way, and he intends to be ready for it. He would be ready. He would be celebrated for it. He would become, in the imagination of posterity, the saviour of Europe. Odo the Great returned to Toulouse and began the work of administering a duchy that had survived its worst crisis so far. He had no way of knowing that the worst crisis was still 11 years away. The Umayyad expansion into Gaul did not end at Toulouse. History is rarely that clean. In the years that followed the battle, Umayyad forces based in Narbonne continued their operations east and north, raiding deep into Burgundy by 725, reaching the city of Autun, demonstrating that the appetite for European territory had not been extinguished by a single defeat, only redirected. The garrison at Narbonne held that city for another 3 decades, a persistent Umayyad presence on the northern side of the Pyrenees that would not be finally expelled until 759. The threat was not over, but the nature of the threat had changed. Al-Sam's systematic campaign of permanent conquest, garrison cities, administrative infrastructure, the deliberate construction of a new province, had been the last attempt at that kind of methodical expansion into Western Gaul. What followed was raiding and opportunism, exploiting political divisions among the Franks, entering as invited guests in factional disputes rather than as conquerors in their own right. The ambition of turning Gaul into Al-Andalus north died in the field outside Toulouse. What lived on was more complicated and more important. The Arab world remembered Toulouse. This is perhaps the most remarkable fact about the battle, that the losing side preserved its memory better than the winning side did. The date of the battle, the name of the place, the scale of the loss, these were recorded and maintained and mourned in the Islamic world for 4.5 centuries. Balat al-Shuhada, the path of the martyrs, was the name given to the place where Al-Sam made his last stand. And that name and that place remained present in the collective memory of the Caliphate long after the Christian chroniclers had moved on to more celebrated victories. Arab historians who analysed the failure pointed consistently to the overconfidence of the besieging force, to the failure of intelligence on the western approaches to the camp, to the tactical surprise that Odo had achieved. They understood what had happened. They took it seriously. The Christian West, by contrast, largely forgot. Not immediately. Odo's victory was celebrated at the time, genuinely, and with appropriate recognition of its significance. Pope Gregory II's gifts to the Duke were not pro forma acknowledgements. They were expressions of real relief from a Rome that understood very clearly how close the situation had come to being irreversible. For a decade after Toulouse, Odo was the man who had saved Western Gaul, and his reputation reflected that. Then came 732. Came Bordeaux, where Odo faced a second Umayyad invasion, this one led by the same Abd al-Rahman al-Ghafiqi who had escaped from Toulouse, and was defeated. Came the retreat north to beg assistance from Charles Martel, the man who had refused to help 11 years before. Came the formal acceptance of Frankish overlordship, the surrender of Aquitanian independence, the price that survival extracted from Odo's dignity. And then came Tours, where Charles Martel destroyed Abd al-Rahman's army and became, in the telling that history preferred, the man who saved Europe. The history of Tours was written by men who served the Carolingian dynasty that Charles Martel founded. The history of Toulouse was not written by anyone in particular, because no dynasty arose from Odo's victory. He won the battle and lost the story. He saved the city and lost the century. He died around 735, possibly in a monastery, having spent his final years in the reduced circumstances of a man who once ruled independently and had been obliged to acknowledge a more powerful overlord. His son, Hunald, inherited Aquitaine as a Carolingian dependency, not a free duchy. But here is the thing that the story of Toulouse demands that we sit with for a moment, because it matters. Charles Martel's victory at Tours in 732 was built on a foundation that Odo had laid at Toulouse in 721. The time between those two battles, 11 years, was the time Charles spent building the heavy cavalry, consolidating the Frankish military machine, securing his northern borders, creating the institutional framework of an army capable of facing and defeating the Umayyad force that Abd al-Rahman brought to Tours. He had that time because Toulouse had been held. He had that time because the Caliphate's systematic campaign of conquest in western Gaul had been broken, its governor killed, its siege army destroyed by a man who did it without Carolingian help, on a morning in June when no one, perhaps not even Odo himself, was entirely certain it would work. The forgotten saviour is a recurring figure in history, the person who creates the conditions for another person's celebrated success, who bears the cost of the gamble that makes the celebrated victory possible, who then fades from the story because the story, once it finds a hero, tends to stop looking for more. Odo the Great is one of the clearest examples of this figure in the early medieval period. His name should be as well known as Martel's. By most honest assessments of strategic importance, his victory was at least as significant. The metrics are, if anything, more impressive. Fewer resources, more desperate circumstances, more complete tactical surprise. An enemy force that had never been defeated in Europe and was operating at the height of its confidence. He won anyway. Walk through Toulouse today and you will find no monument to Odo the Great. The city has changed so completely from its 8th century self that the battlefield north and west of the Roman walls, where Al-Sam's army was destroyed in the early morning hours of June 9th, 721, is now covered by the infrastructure of a modern European city. Roads and buildings, and all the accumulated weight of 13 centuries of continuous habitation. The field, called Balat al-Shuhada, where the last organised Umayyad resistance made its stand, is somewhere under all of it. There is no marker. There is no annual commemoration. The Muslim world remembered Toulouse for 450 years. The Christian world forgot it in roughly a century. History is written by the institutions that survive. And the institution that survived in Western Gaul was the Carolingian dynasty, not the House of Odo. The monks who kept the records served Charlemagne's grandfathers and great-grandfathers. They wrote what they needed to write, remembered what it served their patrons to remember, and allowed the rest to become silence. But silence is not erasure. The battle happened. The catapults fell. The man from Aquitaine rode into the dark tree line and came out of it at exactly the right moment, with exactly enough force to do exactly the right thing. Al-Sam ibn Malik al-Khawlani, Governor-General of Al-Andalus, died of his wounds in Narbonne, with the knowledge that his careful, systematic, thoroughly planned campaign of conquest had been destroyed by a man who had been given no help and had found a way anyway. Centuries later, the tourists walk the streets of Toulouse and eat their cassoulet and drink their wine from Gaillac and watch the planes circle toward Blagnac Airport. And none of them, almost none of them, know that somewhere beneath their feet lies the place where the continent's future was settled on a June morning by a duke that history forgot. History does not always remember the men who save it, but it is saved nonetheless. And sometimes, in the silence between the documents, in the gap between what was written and what was done, you can still hear the sound of hooves wrapped in cloth, moving through darkness toward a camp that does not know it is about to die. and the voice of a man who refused, against every reasonable calculation, to let his city fall. That is the sound of Toulouse 721. It never entirely stops.